So let me begin, if I could, on a very personal note, hopefully not a self-indulgent one. I spent 6 years or so on and off working on my new book, Judaism is About Love, and in many ways I've spent the last 25 years writing this book. And I share this because when the galleys of the book, the pre-publication version of the book, arrived at my house after all these years, it was Saturday morning, October 14th, a week after October 7th, and I was, like so many of us, overwhelmed with grief, bewilderment, rage. I'm actually still trying to figure out how it's possible at the same time to feel completely numb and like you might suffocate from anxiety at the same time. I really actually still don't understand how that's possible, and yet that's what it was like. And I turned to my wife when the postal deliverer dropped the box, and I said, I have no interest in this book at all. And if you've ever written a book or been involved in the writing of a book, you know that that response borders on insane, right? People, tear into a box of galleys the way little kids tear into a chocolate bar, right? And I let the box sit there day after day after day. I was really unable to open it. My main reaction, my main attitude towards years of my own work was, I would say, a kind of broken indifference. And I found myself wondering, in a moment like this, who on earth would want to talk about love? So I was very startled by people's response, because a few days in, I started saying to my colleagues at work and to some other rabbis I was involved in learning with and teaching, I started saying to them, I'm not interested in this book. I don't want to talk about love. And one after another, they all said some version of the same thing. I understand what you're saying, but you have this totally backwards. Student after student kept saying to me, I actually want to talk about love more now than I ever have in my life. And I have to be honest, I didn't really feel what they were saying, and I'll be even more honest and say it's 11 months later, I'm still not really fully feeling what they were saying. But slowly, over the course of months, I came to realize something that I found extremely moving, which is that all these people who were saying to me that they wanted to talk about love now more than they ever had before were actually tapping in to a very profound Jewish insight that I had actually written about in the book but lost access to. They were tapping into the idea, which I want to try to develop a little bit for you today, the idea that one of the most powerful responses Jewish theology offers us to destruction and devastation is a defiant insistence on more love. Imagine, seriously, living in a world that feels to you totally coherent and meaningful. Imagine inhabiting a world in which you are confident that God is there, that God cares about you, and that you know where God's presence can be found. In more modern language, we might say, imagine living in a world that is totally not yet disenchanted. You know what your obligations are, you know what your commitments are, and when you fall short of them, you actually know exactly where to go and what to do in order to make things whole again. That is the world, as the sages at least imagine the world was when the Beit HaMikdash stood. Right? When the temple stood, there was order to the world. According to the book of Shemot, when God commands Bnei Israel, the Israelites, to build the Mishkan or the tabernacle, God's reason is actually so poignantly simple. It's that God wants to dwell with us. The end of Exodus 29, V'shachanti b'toch b'nei Israel, v'ayiti lahem le'Elohim, I will dwell among the people of Israel, and I will be their God. And then, in a fascinating passage, it is easy to miss this when you read Shemot, because you have in your head the idea that the purpose of the Exodus, if you will, the climax, the culmination, is arrival in the land, In Exodus 29, that's not true. Listen to what Exodus 29 says. V'yadeu ki ani Adonai Elohehem, and they will know that I, the Lord, am their God, asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took them out of the land of Egypt, towards what purpose? L'shochni v'tocham, to be with them. Ani Adonai Elohehem. To be with them. That's why he took them out. That passage is not about the land of Israel. It's not denying it, but that's not where it's placing its emphasis. It's about divine human togetherness. And that's what the Mishkan, and by extension, the Beit HaMikdash, are meant to symbolize. For Chazal, for our sages, the Beit HaMikdash was nothing less than the center of the world. Actually, in the theology, or if you will, in the geography of the rabbinic imagination, Yerushalayim is the center of the world, and the Beit HaMikdash is the center of the center. I always found it amazing, by the way, if you read Psalms that talk about how Jerusalem is on the highest mountain, and you look up and you see how glorious it is. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Jerusalem. It's not that high, right? It's actually a kind of spiritual seeing, right? When you see something that you imagine as a center, oh my God, it is the most exalted place on earth. And then, right, we know that when the Romans come and do what they do, it's all gone. I'm doing this for a reason. I realize that this is not a Tisha B'Av speech, okay? Just bear with me for a minute. Listen for a second to how Jewish historians describe the wake of the year 70. The destruction, one of them says, was, quote, one of the most cataclysmic crises of Jewish history. Another explains, no longer did Judaism have a center, a temple, a priesthood, a place to bring sacrifices. With the temple gone, a third historian writes, much of Jewish life lay shattered. This is perhaps most poignantly expressed in a passage in Avot de Rabbi Natan, in a Midrash, and I'll read it only in English for the purpose of time. I think this explains the trauma so powerfully. So long as the temple service is maintained, the world is a blessing to its inhabitants, and the rains come down in season. But when the temple service is not maintained, the world is not a blessing to its inhabitants, and the rains do not come down in season. Without it, without the temple, the very source of life and of sustenance is gone. The world is emptier, a less fertile place. And of course, as you know, after the year 70, it wasn't just that the center of the world had disappeared, it's that the old theological explanations all fell flat. Right? We still find ourselves saying in the davening, Mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu, because of our sins we were exiled from our land, and the sages after the year 70 did not believe it. And they didn't know what to do. And by the way, I actually just want to invite you for a minute to step into the poignancy of this, that it is so painful to live in a world that makes no sense that many of us would rather a story which blames us for our own suffering than a story that makes no sense at all. And in a very different register, you no doubt know people, maybe you've been this person, who tells a story about their own life that is filled with actually improper self-blame, because at least that way the world, quote-unquote, makes some sense. Okay, so why am I talking about all this, other than my clear goal of lifting your spirits? Why am I talking about all this? Because I think that the sages of the Talmud offer us two responses to this that are both breathtaking and that are actually quite easy to miss the deeper meaning of. And I want to invite you for a minute to think about these with me, and then ask yourself, I'm not going to belabor this point, how this might help us as a community living in a time of such great destruction and devastation. So as I just said, among the temple's many functions it was a place where people could go when they had transgressed to atone for their sins. And there's a very famous story, those of you who have prayed for years in the Sim Shalom Sidur may have noticed that the editor of that Sidur even tried to make this part of the daily liturgy. They quote this at the beginning of the Tefillot for Shabbat. Just listen to this story here again. To go back to a theme I talked about last night, here again is a story that will not be new to many of you, but I want to invite you to consider hearing it again for the first time, as if for the first time. Once, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was coming forth from Yerushalayim, you know where the story is going, but stay with me for a minute, Rabbi Yeshua followed after him and beheld the Beit HaMikdash in ruins. Woe unto us, cried Rabbi Yehoshua, that this place, the place where the iniquities of the Jewish people were atoned for, is laid waste. To which Rabbi Yochanan responds, my son, be not grieved. We have another atonement that is like it, kimotah. And what is it? It is acts of love and kindness. Chesed, as it said, ki chesed chafatzti v'lo zevach. Because it is love that I desire rather than sacrifice, from the prophet Hosea. Atonement through sacrifice may not be possible, Rabbi Yochanan says, but we have an alternative. What is the alternative? An act of reaching out to another person in a moment of vulnerability and showing them kindness. And later Talmudic passages go so far as to say, this is as Jewish chutzpah grows. No, it is not that an act of loving kindness is as good as a sacrifice. It is that an act of loving kindness is in fact far superior to a sacrifice. As the Midrash imagines God telling Bnei Israel, the kindnesses you do for one another far outweigh anything that Shlomo HaMelech ever did for me in the temple. Now my question is, this is beautiful, but what does it actually mean? Right? Why do they say this? Why, when the source of forgiveness and reconciliation is gone, do the sages, or specifically Rabbi Yochanan, turn and say, okay, don't panic. There's an alternative to zevach, to sacrifice, and the alternative is acts of love. There is, I think, a surface answer and a more profound answer. The surface answer lies in a Mishnah that is familiar to many, if not all of you, the teaching of Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik, that the world stands on three pillars: on Torah, on the service of God, avodah, and on gemilut chasadim, and on act of loving kindness. So if one of the legs falls, you hold for dear life onto the other two. But I want to suggest another possibility that I think is deeper and more profound and actually really worth sitting with in some very deep place. The book of Proverbs argues repeatedly that the way we treat other people is, in fact, how we treat God. Remember the passage that you're all familiar with from Western culture, from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25. Trust me, you're all familiar with this, even if you don't know you are. As you have done to the least of these, so have you done unto me. Sound familiar? No? None of you? You're all so frum, you don't know what I'm talking about. So I'll tell you, right? Jesus famously says, right, I was hungry and you fed me, etc. And they say, when, Master, did we do this? And he says, as you did to the most vulnerable, so did you do unto me. Here's the thing that Jews don't know, and Christians usually traditionally don't acknowledge. Jesus is riffing on the book of Proverbs, on Mishlei, which repeatedly says, what you do for a poor person is what you do to God. An amazing verse in Mishlei says, when I give a loan to a poor person, it's as if I just handed God a gift. Why is that? How is that? Because in some very deep way, there is a structural similarity between bringing a sacrifice and offering an act of kindness. In both cases, we open our hands to God and say, here. In both cases, That is exactly what we are doing. The Maharal, Rabbi Judah Loew of Prague, says, in this world, the closest thing most of us will ever come to seeing the face of God is the face of the person in front of you. That is the closest you will ever have in this life to a revelation of God. The word for an idol of God is a tselem. Does that sound familiar? By the way, this is not my topic. Don't worry, I'm not going to go on too long. The reason it is forbidden in the Bible. The reason it is forbidden to make images of God is not because you may not have many, said that wrong, is not because you may not have any, but because there may only be one. You can't make an image of God because the only image of God that is permissible is already there and you didn't make it. You are it. So when you give something to an image of God, you are giving it to God. In other words, I think what Rabbi Yochanan understood is that when you engage in an act of love for another person, you are making a sacrifice. You're handing something to God. Imagine now for a minute actually seeing and treating people this way. One of the most amazing experiences I ever had when you've been doing what I do as long as I've been doing it is that you meet some really fascinating characters. I mean, I've met some real loons, and I've met some real tzaddikim. I mean, I've met a lot of people in my travels. I was very young. I was giving a shiur in a synagogue in Dallas, Texas, if I remember correctly, and I said something about the halacha of when you see a Sefer Torah on the floor, what you have to do. And a woman makes a beeline for me after shul and says, imagine how much more sacred a person is and what none of us do when we see a person lying on the ground. So that's response number one. Love replaces sacrifice because love is a tremendous gift to God. In the face of devastation, in the face of feeling like we've lost God, there is a revelation of God right in front of us. Now here's response two, which is a version of the same thing. For many years, there was one passage in the Mishnah that drove me completely crazy. Here's how it goes. Mishnah Ta'anit, Perek Daled Mishnah Vav, tells us, this is familiar to you, if not the Mishnah, then at least the idea, that everything awful that ever happened on Tisha B'Av. The first temple fell. The second temple fell. The generation of the desert found out that they would never enter the land. And then throughout Jewish history, every time Jews were massacred, right? Tisha B'Av. Now, one Mishnah later, the Mishnah tells us that the 15th of Av, 6 days later, was one of the two happiest days of the year. And the reason? Because women would go out into the field and dance, and they would couple off with men. And this was one of the two happiest days of the year. Now, please forgive me not saying this as respectfully if I could. This is utterly insane. Imagine for a minute that I'm sitting Shiva for the destruction of the universe, and you walk in and say, I know what we should do. Let's have a singles party. This is like a Jewish grandmother's version of a Mishnah. Oh, you're in mourning? Let's have a mixer. Right? This is like, it's so odd. Right? This used to drive, I'm telling you, for years I would read this Mishnah and it drove me crazy. Like, why did they do this? Why make a holiday about love when either, if the temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av, you literally just got up from Shiva that morning. If, as the prophet Zechariah says, the temple was still burning on the 10th of Av, you're not even done with Shiva yet, but you have to gussy yourself up. I don't even know what that term means, but gussy yourself up and go to a party. It doesn't really make any sense. And then, a few years ago, it suddenly hit me that the sages were actually doing something that is so profound, it is worth just kind of like, I don't know, allowing our mind to be boggled. They are aware that trauma so often shuts us down. Trauma physically makes you go like this, right? Trauma closes us off from the deepest walls of love and compassion we're capable of. So you know what the rabbis say? Right when you're shutting down, right when you can't do it anymore, we're going to have a holiday and reaffirm love. We're not even going to let Shiva be over yet. We're not going to let the shutting down take over us. No, right then, when it's about to happen, we're going to have a holiday that celebrates love. That is the ultimate act of spiritual defiance. It's the ultimate act of spiritual defiance. And I want to say something else. I have been asked over and over and over again in the last few months, you know, if you had written this book after October 7th, would you write anything differently? And there are paragraphs here and paragraphs there that I might word a little differently. But I want to say something that is actually really important to me. The real answer to this question is no. And the reason is because never, no matter what, under any circumstances, will I allow anti-Semites to define for me what I understand the Torah to be about. Never. Anti-Semites will not take away my focus and the Torah's focus on love. They will not do it. And so there's something here. There's one last point to this that is, I think, really profound. Because Tu B'Av, 15th of Av, is a symbol of reaffirming love in the face of destruction. But the rabbis insist on one really striking point of halakha about Tu B'Av, which you may be familiar with, which is that when the women went out to meet the men, they all wore borrowed clothing. And why did they do that? Because, you know, sometimes people like to show off with how much they have. And they make other people feel bad. By the way, that's my least favorite part of Jews on Shabbat. Shabbat, the prohibition, the traditional halachic prohibition on handling money is in part about enacting the deeper truth of egalitarianism. Edgar Bronfman is not worth more than I am. He's not in any way that really matters, which is why I don't have money on Shabbat. But then what do? We show off with our clothes. Because why? Human beings are difficult. Because we are who we are. But the Mishnah says they wore borrowed clothing. Because, and this is part of what I think the point is, and with this I close, the love that couples felt for each other was not meant to be limited to the love they felt for each other. It was actually meant, love is meant to open us to others. That's the real reason why a chuppah doesn't have walls. Because you know what young people often think? That their love really is the center of the world and no one else matters. So as an act of educating them, we keep the chuppah walls open and say, you know, there are other people right now who may not feel loved, who may not have what they need. So Tu B'Av is it's so extraordinary. Yes, love each other, but do it in a way that has its eyes completely on the poorest members of this community. Love in a way that is expansive rather than the narcissism of two replacing the narcissism of one. So this is the thing, right? In the face of destruction, more love. That's the argument. That's the argument. I don't think I'm making any of this up. I think this is what the sages of the Talmud are saying to us, but you always have to know how to read them. Because the sages of the Talmud rarely come along and say, let me hit you over the head with the spiritual lesson I want you to learn. They ask you to pay attention. Pay attention to the process of chesed replacing sacrifice. Pay attention to holding a wedding 6 days after the temple is destroyed. Pay attention to not showing off what you have precisely at the moment when you want to celebrate. Look what I got. And so all those people who said to me, I want to talk about love now more than ever, actually were accessing, I think, something in Torah that I was not able to. And I feel like they taught me something really incredibly important, which is that even now when it hurts, when I'll just speak for myself, walk around most of the time feeling bewildered, angry, combative. I could go on for like 3 hours here. Maybe there's a few therapists here, we could talk over Kiddush, right? Even now, and especially now, they taught me what I think the Mishnah teaches us, which is just when you don't want to hear it anymore, the answer remains more love.